Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. This time we're getting kind of meta,
It indeed.
We're diving into this source called, get this, Following God's Blueprint, Obedience, Worship, and the Tabernacle in Exodus 24:27. And are you ready for this? It's a podcast script from 2024.
A podcast script from the future talking about the ancient past. It's like we've stumbled into a time warp of biblical proportions.
Right. Talk about a deep dive. But it gets even better. This script uses the book of Exodus to talk about faith and obedience in a modern context. And I got to say, some of their takes are, well, let's just say they're giving me a lot to think about.
What I find fascinating is how they've chosen to frame these ancient stories. By putting a 2024 spin on them, we get this really unique glimpse into how they view their relationship with faith, with God, even with something as seemingly mundane as instructions.
And that's what I'm really curious about. How do they connect those dots? Like, we're talking about the Israelites building a tabernacle according to God's super specific instructions. How does that translate to their lives in 2024? What does it even look like to follow a blueprint that old in a world that's changing faster than ever?
It's a great question, and it's one this source tackles head on, but they start by setting the stage, taking us back to that pivotal moment at Mount Sinai. Imagine it. Moses is up on the mountain having a chat with God.
Casual Friday on Mount Sinai, am I right?
Exactly. But down at the base camp, things are about to get real. The Israelites are about to make a commitment, a huge commitment.
Without reading the fine print, I'm guessing.
You could say that. The source points out that they agree to follow God's commands before actually knowing what those commands are.
Ooh, that's a bold move. I don't know if I've ever agreed to something without knowing all the details. Maybe ordering a mystery cocktail at a bar.
Maybe, but on a much grander scale, of course. And that's the point they're driving at the Israelites' initial enthusiasm, that whole, yes, let's do this. Energy, it's powerful, but it sets the stage for the tension that inevitably arises when the rubber meets the road.
Because saying you're going to do something and actually doing it are two very different things. And I have a feeling those ancient Israelites are about to get a crash course in that very lesson.
Oh, absolutely. But before we get to that, let's talk about the blueprint itself, because this is where things get really interesting. We're not just talking about vague guidelines here. God gives incredibly specific instructions for building the tabernacle materials, dimensions, the whole shebang. It's like IKEA assembly on a cosmic scale, with way higher stakes if you mess up.
Okay, so I'm picturing this massive instruction manual falling from the sky. What's the source's take on all that detail? Was God just having a micromanager moment?
That's a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries. But this source, they suggest it's all about emphasizing the importance of precise obedience.
So, no cutting corners when you're building a dwelling place for the divine architect, huh?
Precisely. They even go so far as to say that every detail, every gold clasp, every acacia wood beam, it all points towards something larger, something profoundly meaningful.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown.
Yep.
So we've got a blueprint, we've got instructions, but how do we get from that ancient mountaintop to us sitting here today?
Well, that, my friend, is the million-dollar question, and it's one this source doesn't shy away from.
So how do we take this ancient blueprint, this idea of precise obedience, and apply it to our lives today?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And this source, they offer a really intriguing answer by focusing on one specific detail of the tabernacle.
Ooh, lay it on me.
The eternal flame. Remember, God specifically instructed the Israelites to keep the lamps in the tabernacle burning all night, every night.
Right. Always felt a bit extra to me, like, couldn't God see in the dark?
Well, there you go, viewing it through that practical lens again. And it's easy to do that. But this source is encouraging us to think about it differently. Remember, the tabernacle was meant to be a dwelling place for God, a physical manifestation of his presence among the people.
Okay, I'm listening.
So if the tabernacle represents that divine presence, what does it mean to keep it lit, so to speak, even in the darkest night? It becomes less about illumination and more about maintaining a connection, a constant awareness.
I see what you mean. It's like when you send a text and you see that little typing bubble pop up. You know the other person is there, present with you, even before they've said a word.
Exactly. It's about that feeling of connection. And this source, they highlight the emotional weight of this continuous effort, the tending of the flame. They argue that it wasn't just a chore for the Israelites. It was an act of devotion, a way to demonstrate their commitment even when no one was watching.
Okay, that's actually really beautiful when you put it like that. It's like, what are the eternal flames we tend in our own lives? The things we keep going even when it's hard, because they reflect something deeper about who we are.
Yes. And this source, they don't shy away from the fact that we mess up sometimes. They actually use a pretty, well, let's say a pretty memorable story to illustrate that point.
Please tell me they're talking about the golden calf incident. Because, I mean, if we're talking about messing up, that's kind of the gold standard, right? Pun intended.
It went there. And it's such a perfect example because it speaks to that very human struggle between aspiration and reality.
Right. Like, we're all gung-ho at the foot of the mountain, ready to conquer the world.
Yeah.
And then doubt creeps in, we get impatient, we take shortcuts, and bam, golden calf.
And that's where this source's interpretation really resonated with me, because they get that we're human, we're going to mess up. It's less about achieving perfect obedience and more about engaging in an ongoing conversation.
Conversation with who? God.
Exactly. With God, with the source of the instructions, whatever that looks like for you. Imagine, instead of blindly following a set of rules, you're in dialogue with the person who wrote them.
So less like following a recipe and more like collaborating on a masterpiece.
Now you're getting it. And within that collaborative process, there's room for mistakes, for detours, even for golden calves. Because each of those missteps is an opportunity for learning, for refining our understanding, for deepening the conversation itself.
I love that. So it's not about being perfect, it's about being present, being engaged, being willing to course correct when needed. But we're still talking about ancient Israelites, an ancient tabernacle. How does all of this translate to our lives in 2024?
Well, that's exactly what this 2024 podcast episode tries to answer.
So we're diving into a podcast from the future, talking about ancient instructions for building a tabernacle. And somehow, this is all supposed to be relevant to our lives in 2024. I'm intrigued, but I'll admit I'm also a little lost.
Well, get ready to be found, because this is where it all comes together. See, this 2024 podcast, they hit their listeners with this really pointed question. They ask, in 2024, when God speaks to us, whether through scripture or in prayer, we're expected to follow his direction fully, not halfway. So I'm throwing this back to you, listener. How do you interpret that? Are we talking about blind obedience, taking everything literally, or is there something more nuanced going on here?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Because if we're talking about following directions, the first thing I want to know is, well, what are the directions? And how do we know we're interpreting them correctly? Especially when it comes to something as complex as faith.
That's where the idea of the blueprint comes back in. Remember that striking image from earlier, the one about building our lives according to God's blueprint. What jumps out at you about that metaphor?
Well, blueprints make me think about intentionality. Like, if our lives are the blueprints, are we putting thought into the foundation, the materials we're using? Or are we just kind of winging it, hoping for the best?
You hit the nail on the head. Intentionality is key here. They're saying it's not enough to just go through the motions. It's about actively engaging with the source material, whether it's scripture, your own inner wisdom, whatever resonates with you, and then figuring out how those principles apply to your life today.
So it's less about having all the answers and more about being willing to ask the questions, to wrestle with the big ideas, and figure out what resonates with our own experiences.
Exactly. And that requires discernment, right? It means being able to say, okay, this teaching might have made sense in ancient times, but how does it apply to the world we live in now?
Yeah, it's like we wouldn't expect someone building a house today to use the exact same tools and techniques as they did thousands of years ago. So why would our approach to faith be any different? We have to be able to adapt, to evolve, while still honoring those core principles.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating. It's not about replicating the past. It's about using those foundational principles, those ancient blueprints, to create something new, something relevant for our own time.
It's about recognizing that we're all architects of our own lives, tasked with building something meaningful, something lasting.
Powerful, isn't it? And maybe, just maybe, as we grapple with these big questions, as we strive to build our lives with intention and purpose, we'll discover that even the most ancient of blueprints can inspire incredible acts of creation in our modern world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, this has been The Deep Dive, reminding you to always keep digging, keep questioning, keep building. Until next time, happy